moderating today's webcast on plain language summaries. The webcast is offered through the Center on Knowledge Translation for Disability and Rehabilitation Research, KTDRR, which is funded by the National Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Research. I also want to thank my colleague Ann Williams, our webinar administrator, for her logistical and technical support for today's webcast. The webcast today is a response to a technical assistance request from Cornell University's Employment and Disability Institute, which is the home of several NIDER-funded projects. The webcast format makes it possible for others to benefit from this information on using plain language to share research findings. The recorded webcast will be made available on the KTDRR website in the near future. The KTDRR Center is working with a number of national and international partners, and we are pleased to count the Campbell Collaboration among those partners. Our speaker today, Merete Konnerup, is the co-chair of Campbell's Users Group that initiated user abstracts for Campbell Collaboration systematic reviews. Another KTDRR project related to using plain language is an online tool under development by colleagues at the University of Washington's ADA KT Center. The plain language tool will help researchers in gathering all the necessary information to draft a plain language summary. We will be launching the tool later this summer and will offer another webcast at that time to introduce the plain language tool. I'm now going to hand the virtual microphone to Sarah von Schrader. Sarah? It was a couple of months ago our research team sort of identified plain language summaries as an area that we wanted to have a little bit of professional development around. And I don't think we actually called it plain language summaries, but that was the gist of it. Hannah suggested working with the KTDRR Center to set something up, and here we are today. So I just want to thank everybody for their efforts in putting this together. As we listen to our speaker today, I just want to say that this is supposed to be a pretty interactive session. We have time for questions, so keep thinking about where you would like to learn more and sort of jot down your questions as we go. And I'm going to actually just hand the mic right next to me to Hannah to introduce our speaker today.
Hello, everyone. We're delighted to have Merete Konnerup with us this morning to provide an overview and insights around creating plain language summaries. Merete is the manager for programs within social well-being with the Trygg Fonden Foundation in Lyngby, Denmark. How did I do, Merete?
Beautiful. Beautifully.
Merete has a MS in economics, and her current work focuses on research-based and economic analysis, knowledge transfer, evidence-based policy and practice, research synthesis methods, and strategic research leadership. Merete was the first director of the Nordic Campbell Center at SFI in Copenhagen, Denmark, the Campbell Collaboration's first regional center. From 2002 to 2009, she built this center up from scratch and developed it as a cornerstone of the collaboration. She also played a key role in the center's successive What Works conferences that engaged many practitioners and policymakers in the theory and practice of evidence-based policy. The decision of the Danish Parliament in 2008 to award the center permanent funding is testimony to Merete's pioneering work in this area. So we're delighted to pass the microphone to Merete now for her presentation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, I'm sorry there's no picture here because I'm blushing here at the end of it. So thank you very much to everybody who's been involved in making this possible. I'm going to talk about plain language summaries today, but I hope you'll allow for me to do kind of a short introduction to the use of science in public policy. And the reason for this perhaps a bit lofty introduction is to illustrate kind of the very large complexities that we are trying to grapple with when we set out to write plain language summaries. Because a lot of what is going on when it comes to the use of promoting the use of science in public policy is based on a kind of a simple one-way dissemination of information approach, and that falls completely short of being seriously effective. And this, in this introduction, I'd like to draw your attention to the work of a specific committee, because in the spring of 2005, so that's some years ago, I had the honor of appearing before a group of very distinguished scholars, which was the U.S. National Academy's Committee on the Use of Social Science Knowledge in Public Policy. This committee was established, I assume, at that point in time, because there were concerns of the lack of use of social science knowledge in public policy, and this committee, with its very distinguished set of scholars, kind of got to work to do analysis and discussions and workshops on how to increase the use of social science knowledge. And scholars as they are, their first approach was, of course, what does research tell us about how to increase the use of social science policy? And what they came up with was almost nothing. So what they have come out with just last year was this report, which I can recommend tremendously, is Using Science as Evidence in Public Policy. Here they write, knowledge from all the sciences is relevant to policy choice. Making use of scientific knowledge is what people and organizations do, and what people and organizations do is the focus of social science. And what they'd found through their analysis and discussions and debates and their search for science on this topic is that there was practically nothing available. So their report is a call to arms to actually establish almost a new research framework. And here they say our research framework argues for more careful study of policy argumentation, as well as for increased roles for the psychology of decision making and for a systems perspective too. So I'll return to these three important framework pillars that they have set out. It's not completely void of research, this area. A few pioneers perhaps have been working in this area. You're perhaps familiar with the late Professor Carol H. Weiss, who's actually a Cornell graduate. She's credited with creating the field research utilization. And another pioneer is from public health, which is an area where they have actually done early and pretty good work in knowledge translation and exchange, and generally the use of science in health policy. And here one of the pioneers was the director of the Canadian Institute of Health Research, Jonathan Lomas. And there they developed what I would call, going now from the big picture to the big picture, of course a stylized model, but a model nevertheless of knowledge translation and exchange, or knowledge to action process as they call it. What you can see here is you can zoom in at the top of the triangle and you see there is knowledge inquiry. So you actually have actual primary research, a very, well, in the bigger picture here, a very small part or the beginning of a long chain of translational processes that moves into synthesis, onwards to tools and products, tailoring knowledge, dissemination, and then moves into action cycle where someone or an organization identifies a problem, goes searching for the knowledge in the area, adapt the knowledge to a local context, assess the barriers for the use of this knowledge, select and tailor implementation interventions, monitor knowledge use, evaluate outcomes, sustain knowledge use, and so on and so forth. A key point here is that identifying the problem is actually the most constructive approach to looking at these types of questions, as well the operational unit of analysis is a problem when we are talking about the use of research or science in public policy, not actually a single piece of research. So this was kind of the model that the Canadian Institute of Health Research, or Jonathan Lomas, set up And today we're talking about plain language summaries, which is kind of a small area, in this very big knowledge to action process. And this was kind of the short summary where we drilled down, and now we're at kind of the plain language summaries, which are a small cog in this very big machine. But let me tell you something about our experience at the Campbell Collaboration. The Campbell Collaboration is an international research network that works with and does research in systematic reviewing of effective interventions in the 3 or 4 major policy areas, which is social work, crime and justice, education, and international development. We've now reached a library of 85 systematic reviews, of which about 2/3 are covered by user abstracts. It's an official Campbell Collaboration product, and you can all access it in the library on the Campbell Collaboration's homepage. These are peer-reviewed systematic reviews, and it became, for different reasons, and back in history when I was heading off the Nordic Campbell Center, we started working with the researchers and my team on developing a user abstract. And the development of these user abstracts, or plain language summaries, was basically through trial and error. And then you can get a good idea of how things develop by going into the library and take a look at some of the older user abstracts and compare them to some of the new user abstracts. What we've learned has been put together in a guideline for writing Campbell Collaboration User Abstracts, and I will give you some of the upshots of kind of the lessons learned that we had through this. This was a period that stretched over 4 or 5 or 6 years as we kind of developed generation 1, 2, and 3. I've lost track. I think we are at generation 4 or 5 in user abstracts now. We learned several things. First of all, we have kind of a very good product to research product, which is a research synthesis. If you remember the kind of the knowledge to Jonathan Lomas's knowledge to action slide, where the big picture is that you've got your primary research, and then you have a synthesis on top of that, and that's a very neat product to run with disinformation wise. So that was a good place to start. But again, as I said, getting research into practice or being used is a very complex chain of events that need to align. And we very quickly decided that the Campbell Collaboration do not have a lot of resources. So our ambition was to develop a standardized generic user abstract, basically not with the ambition to reach out, because potentially we have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of potential users of the knowledge that's been collected in just one review. But our ambition was to do a standardized or develop a standardized user abstract that could be done generically for each of the reviews, and that we would engage with the knowledge brokers or key organizations in each country within these 4 policy areas. And that is what we've done, because those are the ones which are active in the Campbell User Group, for them to have ownership and take ownership of the review and the user abstract, and develop and do the actual very, very important contextualization of that specific review's results into the local context. So that was a decision at the level of resources that we have available, is to develop a standardized, generic, non-contextualized user app for each review. another lesson learned was that we tried out who could actually write these reviews or these user abstracts based on the reviews. And I must say, we tried both having the original authors write them. We tried having end users, policymakers write them. And I must say that the experience with all of these different writers was not a model to follow, because through this process we began to realize and also acknowledge that knowledge translation and exchange abilities just not is a trade or a skill in its own right, because you need people who on the one hand can actually really read and understand minutiae in the systematic review, including some pretty advanced statistical information, and also be able to understand from the point of view of the next step in the chain, kind of the users in one way or the other, but at least a non-researcher. What would they find important? What would they focus on? And thirdly, also someone who had, well, a really good pen, was great at writing stories. And we tried, as I said, a lot of different people. We ended up doing them exclusively in-house and with a select set of young grad students, actually. And not a few of them were able to do it really, really well. And they learned by doing it over a long time and repeatedly, and became better and better at it. Thirdly, we emphasized, because the researchers often, it pained them when a lot of technical details were left out in the user abstract. But we kept repeating, and I think we succeeded in the end to ease their worries by saying the user abstract stands on the shoulders of the systematic review. The review is always available there for anyone who'd want to dig in deeper or check things and so on and so forth. And we need to take advantage of that fact that there's this really, really thorough background report, but take advantage in the meaning that we can write a story in kind of a journalistic, more appropriate way in the user abstract, referring people for further knowledge in the systematic reviews, so that the user abstract is not a completely standalone product, but has legitimacy in the systematic review which is behind it. And then there was a last lesson learned that I'd like to emphasize, and that, of course, is particular to the Campbell reviews, because they all deal with the effectiveness of interventions. And there's a key thing here surrounding the effect size. And I should phrase this very diplomatically, because communicating an effect size in a meaningful way to a non-researcher requires a very, very high level of statistical literacy. Let me give you an example. So what in layman's terms, for a researcher or for anyone to communicate the results in the form of an effect size to a non-research audience needs to really understand the statistics behind an analysis. One example is, for example, we've got a review called The Effectiveness of Incarceration-Based Drug Treatment on Crime Behavior. The effect size that came out of the analysis is a mean odds ratio of 1.37. And I promise you that no one outside bookies or people who play the horses can understand risk in the terms of an odds ratio. And I've actually got research to back me up. The Campbell Collaboration has a sister organization in health called the Cochrane Collaboration. They do systematic reviews as well. And they've done a systematic review on whether laymen or highly trained doctors are able to understand risk when it's termed or when it's written up in odds ratios. And that is not the case. They do not understand it. What we need people to do, and the writer of the plain language summary needs help from the researchers to do, is translate something like an odds ratio of 1.37 into, for example, in this case, you've got recidivism dropping from 35% in the control group to 28% in the intervention group. Now we're getting closer to something that laymen can understand. And there are even, you know, if you have 100 stick men, paint some red, some blue, and so on and so forth, there are ways to engage in risk communication that is so much more effective than odds ratios. So that was another lesson learned, but also another lesson learned on effect size and statistical literacy is that there's an overly focus on the null hypothesis, being that there is no difference between the intervention group and the control group, for example, either that's equivalent to a standard mean difference of 0 or an odds ratio of 1. But sometimes it could be there's enough data, enough information, enough power, statistical power as it's called in the study, for the researcher or the writer of the plain language summary to actually conclude whether it's a large effect size or a medium-sized effect size or a small effect size. We have in the Campbell Collaboration an example of a systematic review of an intervention called multi-systemic therapy, where there are 16 outcome variables on which a meta-analysis is performed using between 200 and 800 participants. And that actually gives power to exclude in some of the instances that the effect size is large, and some of the instances even that it's medium-sized. So as it is now, the review just concludes that all the 16 variables are not statistically significantly different from 0. But if you were to engage with practitioners having to make a choice on whether or not to use multi-systemic therapy, which is a pretty expensive intervention, it is a relevant information in, for example, a plain language summary, whether or not you can exclude the effect size being big. So statistical literacy is actually really, really important when you want to write up and understand what you have in your research and which should be put into the plain language summary. Sometimes a term like practical significance is used as well. So here are examples of some of the headlines of some of the plain language summaries in Campbell, just to give you an idea. But I would invite you to go on the Campbell Library and browse for yourself. Let me return to kind of the research framework that the National Academy's Committee on the Use of Social Science Knowledge in Public Policy suggested, as I go through kind of the best practices and principles of how to write a plain language summary. So that was the psychology. They recommended that when we look at how to promote the use of science and research in public policy, that we should look at the psychology of decision-making, a systems perspective, and policy argumentation. So psychology of decision-making. And here I've said the slow brain talking to the fast brain. And that is actually what I mean when we write plain language summaries. It is actually the slow brain talking to the fast brain. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but in 2011, Professor Daniel Kahneman from Princeton and a Nobel laureate sent out a very interesting book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And he kind of illustrated here how our decision making is governed by two very different systems. You have the fast, instinctive, emotional system, which was basically developed when we were hunters and gatherers and through evolution. And then you've got the slow, deliberate, logical system, which is basically a systematic approach, which is very much akin to how we would do research and how we do science. So when the slow science brain is talking to the fast hunter and gatherer brain, this is actually a very good illustration of how to write what challenge we are up against, or when we write plain language summaries. So these two ways, or these two approaches to decision making that we're all struggling with, are sometimes also illustrated by, we talk about two different storytelling traditions. And the next thing is kind of a caricature, but again, this illustrates well what kind of challenges we are up against. And if we take the slow researcher, kind of the character is, and here it says, the two, well, I think it must be drunks in a bar, I'm sorry. But they say, then we've agreed that all the evidence isn't in, and that even if all the evidence were in, it still wouldn't be definitive. So this is kind of the caricature of the storytelling tradition among the slow-thinking brain or the researcher. And here we have the fast-thinking systems caricature. In the interest of streamlining the judicial process, we'll skip the evidence and go directly to sentencing. So here we have two storytelling traditions clashing, but they are, of course, caricatures. The researcher is characterized by a systematic rule-governed approach that's hopefully, at least it's aimed to guard against self-deception. It's aimed at guarding against believing something is true just because one wants it to be true, while the fast hunter and gatherer brain, that's actually how most of us make decisions most of the time. And this also illustrates what problems one can be up against when we have to evaluate risk, because our way of evaluating risk in general was just streamlined through hundreds of thousands of years of evolution and life as gatherers and hunters. And that fast-thinking brain falls completely short of evaluating risk in a modern society. And that, at least in Campbell, since a lot of our effect sizes deals with increasing or decreasing risk. So you have to face up to the fact that there's a challenge there on how to communicate risk in a meaningful way when you reach out to non-researchers. And welcome to the world of cognitive biases. I mean, this is just me copying out of the list of all our different cognitive biases that the hunter-gatherer, fast-thinking brain runs into when having to evaluate risk in a modern society. So I don't have a lot of solutions here, but there are things in this whole research field that can help us when we try to communicate risk in a way that's more tangible, closer to home, more vivid. Those are some of the things that we need to use if we want to communicate risk in a way that makes sense to the user of our research. Yes. Another of the practices and principles of how to write a plain language summary that needs to be considered is, well, this is almost a moot point, but know your intended audience, who can or should act on your findings. Is it the end user you're reaching out to, the client, the service user? Is it the street level or the high up bureaucrat? Is it research trained professionals, or is it a profession that's more eclectic in its approach? Is it a regional or a national policymaker? Our decision in Campbell with respect to this was that given our resources, the intelligent thing was to reach out to knowledge brokers, who then in turn would be so much more knowledgeable on contextualizing a plain summary, a plain language summary into kind of the local constituency, which is a particular national knowledge broker's whole raison d'etre, their knowledge of and ability and competences of how to reach out to the relevant stakeholders for a specific piece of research, or how to inject it in key policy and practice discussions. So that was the Campbell Collaboration's decision, was to go and try and identify key knowledge brokers. And that, of course, takes how to make that judgment call on what would be the most important next step in the chain is based on your own knowledge on the research and the relevant stakeholders, what are the discussions, what are the policy issues, and so on and so forth. But having done the analysis, that should feed back to how you write up your plain language summary and what your intended audience is. My guess would be that a long stretch of the way, it would be most efficient to reach out to knowledge brokers for them to run on with the knowledge in this particular research report, for example. Then there's the systems perspective. Which organization and which larger system do the intended audience for this research move in? This is an area where Carol Wise have worked, and also Jonathan Lomas. Currently, one of the few research institutes that works in this area is called the Research Unit for Research Utilization at St Andrews and Edinburgh Universities, and it's headed up by Professor Sandra Notley. And in her book, Using Evidence, How Research Can Inform Public Services, she's developed kind of 3 simple, stylized models of research use in an organizational setting: the research-based practitioner model, the embedded research model, and the organizational excellence model. And the research-based practitioner model, in that model, it's the responsibility of the individual practitioner to identify and implement research. Easy access to research is usually provided, and professional training is research-based. My guess would be that health and medicine is a good example of this model. Then there's the embedded research model. Here is the individual practitioner does not engage in research use. Research is embedded in systems, processes, standards, etc. by management. Or my guess would be that more classical command and control organizations are examples of this, as, for example, employment agencies or the criminal justice system. Then you have the organizational excellence model. Here, it's organizations that engage in local experimentation, evaluation, and practice development based on research. And I think the best example I could come up with are the kind of practice organizations that's working with Chapin Hall at Chicago University, and this is in social work. So when you write your plain language summary, you need to consider which of these kind of three stylized cultures your target audience are moving in, because it's pretty important on this actually decides who makes decisions on research, to look for it, to go through it, to use it, or to act on it. Who makes these types of decisions are pretty different in these three different types of organizations. So again, it's down to kind of a diagnostic test of your piece of research and that whole culture you're trying to embed it in. Yep. And then the last on the best practices and principles of how to write a plain language summary. Policy argumentation. What policy and practice discussions are you potentially engaging? And here it's important to remember that, again, that the relevant unit of analysis when you consider or do your diagnostic test of user research, that's really not a single piece of research, but kind of more getting into the pool of what is considered the current best evidence within a field or a policy area, which underpins a specific policy or practice problem. And here here research can play all different kinds of roles, like what is the problem, what is the size and seriousness of the problem, what are the alternative policy or practice options or interventions which are available, what are the expected consequences of these different options or interventions, be they intended or unintended or desired or unwanted, what did in fact result from these options and interventions. So all these different kinds of questions can be answered potentially by a piece of research or more logically a pool of research. And that feeds into policy argumentation. So the key to a good plain language summary is kind of get the big picture and write your own contribution into that big picture, kind of walking in the end user's shoes. Yep, and at the end here, I'd like to point you towards, well, apparently the U.S. National Academies are really interested in this question of the use of, for obvious reasons, the use of science and research in public policy. So there was a very interesting conference last May, and thanks to Joanne Starks, she's spotted that there's a follow-up conference this September, which you all can sign up for now. But there's a lot of proceedings and presentations at this homepage, and the conference was the Science of Science Communication. So I will recommend that, and I strongly recommend that, and I'm already going to look in my calendar to see if I can make it in September. Yes, and you must remember also that each year the Campbell Collaboration is gathered at its colloquium. This year it'll be at Loyola University in Chicago in this upcoming May, so that's not a long time away. I hope to see you there. And wrapping up, I would just remember to invite you to, well, the Campbell Collaboration Users Group is a very motley bunch of all different kind of people who are interested in the kind of questions that I've hopefully presented in a relatively clear way to you today. So if this is any interest of you, please apply to become a member of. We have no resources, so the way it works is that we have a closed LinkedIn group. So if you're a member of LinkedIn, please apply to become a member, and this is just a discussion forum. So now I will leave the word to the moderator, and please invite you to come with all sorts of questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Merete, for a great overview and for identifying some very helpful resources. So now let's take some questions from the audience. Hannah, do you have any questions for us?
First of all, I just wanted to very quickly, a question that I think everybody has initially is, can we get the PowerPoint slides? Can we get the slides for this presentation? Is that going to be possible?
Yes, that is going to be possible. I can send them to you earlier when we have the webcast posted online. We will have the PowerPoint slides, a text version of the slides, and also there will be a transcript. But if you would like, I can get the slides to you earlier. I can send them to you, Hannah, and you can share them with your staff.
Okay, I will do that.
Okay?
Okay, next, I wanted to open it up to anybody in the audience. I will have to run around with the microphone. Does anybody? Oh, there is. Okay. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to start with?
And also for our participants who are online, they can please type your question into the chat box, and we'll get your question from there.
Okay, just a second. Oh.
I'm imagining a huge room with hundreds of people that you're running around with that microphone.
Is this on? Okay. So my question is more to the practical. We work for an ADA center, some of us in here, and I think the why do plain language is important, but our immediate interest is how do we disseminate information to such a broad range of stakeholders that we have in a way that will work for the most people? Are there guidelines that you recommend for us to use to put practical information on the ADA in a way that people can use it?
First of all, I mean, I'm not familiar with the ADA, so you shouldn't take me as knowledgeable in that area. Well, basically, it depends on your resources. I mean, and you're now thinking about your kind of disseminating the whole institute kind of knowledge production, or?
The ADA is a disability rights law here in the state. So we want to translate legal information to people with disabilities, to employers, to people who rent out hotel rooms or serve people in restaurants, the kind of the everyman, in a way they can hear and understand it, and it doesn't feel threatening to them. I think that's succinctly what we try to do.
Well, generally, I think some of the most effective, I mean, we all know or have learned the hard way that kind of the approach of pushing information through brochures or home pages, or that appears not very effective. If this is almost, I hope this, you can accept it for what it is, but creativity is it's such a key, and I think something that marketing people, I mean, there's this whole new field emerging called the behavioral economics, and which have brought forward all this neuroscience and brought forward all our cognitive biases. But it also has shown that some of the most brilliant marketing people over the years have had understandings of people's behavior as their gut understanding. So you need to go native, basically, to sit out among the people you want to reach, and look at almost. I would imagine this almost like an anthropological exercise, seeing how to package something to catch their imagination and their interest, so that they understand that so they can see and relate to. Relate being really, really important word, that this is something that could be useful to them in a way where they can see almost a quick fix sometimes. So, and this is anything but standardized, but then again, my guess would be that you've got a lot of people out there struggling under somewhat similar circumstances with somewhat similar problems, which mean that potentially if you package it in a specific, inventive, creative, thought-provoking way, you might, you can be lucky. Am I making sense here? Can you relate to this?
Okay. Yes, I think we can. I think this is an issue that really strikes at the heart of what we do. And building upon, that was Wendy who asked that question. And building upon Wendy's question, I think I had a question that was sort of in a similar vein. Knowledge translation and the Cochrane Collaborative, a lot of these models were built in the world of healthcare and medical, translating medical findings and so on. We, as Wendy mentioned, our stakeholders are extremely broad, extremely varied, and have their own culture and their own way of viewing the world and their own understanding of disability, which is what we work with. So at what point, not only their own understanding and their own culture, they might have very, very different questions about that they want answered. So the standard model, the sort of the standard model of the scientist generates the knowledge and the policymakers or the practitioners apply that knowledge, this sort of neat, unilinear line doesn't work for us. We have receivers of knowledge who have extremely different, often diametrically opposed motivations in using the knowledge. So at what point I have two questions. At what point should the knowledge users, because for us that's not an easy term, at what point should the knowledge users be involved in the chain of knowledge generation to knowledge use? Should they be involved in actually setting the question that will be researched? Or are they merely involved later in the chain once the research findings are established and we're just talking about how to disseminate them? For research to be meaningful in our field, the stakeholders almost have to be involved in the very setting of the question that's going to be researched. So this begs the second part of the question. You use the word knowledge broker, which is very interesting, might be a very powerful concept for us. And how could you speak a little bit more about how you would find knowledge brokers in our context where we have very, very different knowledge users, very, very different stakeholders with often diametrically opposed motivations in using the knowledge?
Okay, yeah. First of all, the medical model is wrong, to put it bluntly. I mean, because despite the fact that they have been, public health particularly, have been early in trying to grapple with these questions of communicating research to end users, I haven't seen anything innovative come out of that field, really. And if we were to take the whole screening field, whether it be breast cancer or prostate, and that whole field's lack of solving the key question which is how do we communicate the screening results or the risk involved in this to the patient or I mean, this is, they have worked a lot in this field, but I think they are somewhat away from solving it. And I find so much more promise in all this really interesting stuff about our cognitive biases and so on and so forth. Now, onwards to your question of when to involve the users in setting questions. I would be somewhat hesitant in arguing that what the solution, first of all, many researchers in public policy fields are trying to grapple with the fact that the intended end users is a very heterogeneous group. I mean, this is a broad challenge. I would also say that what research questions to state? Well, what are relevant? I would rest my head, instead of having a single end user or a group of them, or how you want to organize it, involved in setting the research questions. In all honesty, I would have more trust in some really brilliant anthropologists going on field research, because what the cognitive biases also tell us, or the neuroscience, is that when we are asked what our problems are, we are not always aware of what they are. And we will say one thing and actually need something different. So it's perilous. One should think very careful about how one wants to involve end users, because yes, they can give a perspective, but I am first and foremost a strong believer in a research approach, and what I'm missing here in general is a research-based approach and not a larger degree of user involvement. And then the question of knowledge brokers, how to find them. This again comes down to if you're there either as an institute with your whole pool of research or as an individual researcher with a specific piece of research, you need to do a diagnostic test of where does this piece of my pool of research fit in. What practice or policy questions or debates does this research fit into? So when someone says that what is the current best evidence relating to problem A or problem C or B, I would like my research to be in that pool. Through a diagnostic test, you would be able to, who are the movers and the shakers in this area? What think tanks think? I mean, again, knowledge brokers, it's a very, I really like the term, but it also covers a very heterogeneous group. But in the US, for example, think tanks are really important for bridging research and policy. Some are very ideological, and some have a high degree of legitimacy. So you need to make that diagnostic test. You have educational institutions who play a key role. You have agencies, and again, even though if you look at kind of the structure in a policy area, through a diagnostic test, you would know that there are key players out there who are more important for getting research into, or for establishing or defining what is the current best evidence for a specific policy question. And it's really difficult for me to give you more guidelines than that. But if you start out from the problem and do a diagnostic test on who are the movers and shakers, people, think tanks, organizations, so on and so forth, that would be the more effective way to get a piece of research or a pool of research into what would be considered, this is the current best evidence, this needs to be considered when we are thinking about answering this or that question.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Hannah, I was thinking while Merete was talking and wondering if your office could not serve as a knowledge broker. I think, it takes some looking at things like she was just saying, but I wonder if you could carry out that role, if you figured out what that role is. Just a thought.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting question. The ADA centers were part of 10 regional centers whose role is, as Wendy mentioned, to disseminate and impact people's decisions on applying the ADA across various spheres of life. So that certainly could be something that would be a possibility. We have a couple of minutes left. Does anybody else have any questions? Anybody else want? Just a second. We have a question. Okay.
Hi, this is Bill Ericsson. I'm a researcher, and just curious how you go about, once you've developed some of these sort of user-friendly documents or whatever, how do you actually test to see if they actually work? Have you actually done that?
Yes and no, but in what we've done over the years is that we've constantly throw them in people's faces and to organizations and invited feedback. But in the true sense of the word, whether or not people are actually, because that's what the test should be, whether actually they run with this piece of information. I'm sorry, I've just never had the access to resources where I would be able to do that. But not being able to do that, what we've generally done is just put ourselves up for scrutiny in all these conferences at the colloquia and so on and so forth, invited people in to evaluate whether they thought this was something that made sense to them or not. And what we also done way back is that we tracked the use of them. So we basically just did a Google search and saw whether or not they were being referenced different places, and kind of just did a count of when that was happened. And there we could see that some user abstracts had a greater impact than others. But then again, it was difficult for us to differentiate because some of the Campbell reviews they were written on were, of course, also on more hotter policy questions than others. And what we did when we supported the production of the reviews, that we had kind of a follow group early on that met 2 or 3 times with the research team, and they would be end users and policymakers and professionals in the area, potentially deciding based on the information gathered in the review, and we would use them as well as kind of sounding boards of the user abstract. So a pretty qualitative approach. Yeah, so that's what we've been able to do up until now.
Thank you.
Well, it looks like we are coming to the end of our hour. Do you think there are any more questions there, Hannah, or should we move on?
No, I was just waiting for the mic, actually. I think we are at the end of our hour. And Merete, this has been fantastic. I think we've all have a lot of food for thought, and we look forward to following up on the resources, the many valuable resources you gave, and following up with you, too, with hopefully further questions. And we have very much enjoyed this hour, very thought-provoking, and we really appreciate your time, Merete.
Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure. Some really insightful questions. Thank you for that.
All righty.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We hope you found today's session to be very informative. And as a reminder, the webcast will be archived on the KTDRR website, www.ktdrr.org, in the near future. We also have a brief online evaluation form and would appreciate your input about this webcast. The link is here on the last page of the PowerPoint file, and as I said, I will send that file to Hannah, and everyone would be able to respond that way. And everyone who registers for the webcast later will also get an email with a link to the evaluation form. So once again, I want to thank you to the folks at EDI and to Merete Konnerup, our presenter, from the staff at the Center on KTDRR. We also appreciate the support from NIDR to carry out the webcast and our other activities. So on this final note, I'd like to conclude the webcast and to invite you to participate in future events. Thank you.